Hi guys, welcome back to Mer Murder, where we put the Mer in murder. I am your host, Mercedes Rose, and I'm so happy you guys are here for another week with me. I don't really have any updates for you guys. Actually, no, I do. I am a pescatarian now. Isn't that crazy? If you know me, you know I love chicken. I love canes. Oh my gosh. I have been on TikTok for the past few weeks. I've been pescatarian for about 3 weeks now. I think when this comes out, it'll be 3 weeks. So it's not really that long, but I have been dedicated and I have been committed. And if you know me, you know I love chicken. So I've been scrolling on TikTok and I just keep looking at things. Like my favorite restaurants are like Shake Shack, Cane's. I like Chick-fil-A. I worked there for like 100 years. So you would think I'd be over it, but every now and then I'm like, chicken strips. No, yeah, it's been hard being like, oh, I can't have this. But also, I'm not that worried because I am a gym girl and I do love salmon and tuna. Actually, my favorite food is seafood. If anybody actually knows, I know I said I love chicken, but I do love seafood. Like, that's my favorite food. Crab legs are my favorite food. So it's not that hard. I'm definitely like living my best life with salmon and shrimp and crab if I can afford it. It's like a treat. Yeah, no, I've been telling my friends that I'm going to be like Bubba from Forrest Gump. I'm just going to know how to make every type of shrimp, every type of salmon. I love seafood though, so I'm not that fazed by it. And as a gym girl, there's lots of protein in these things. Like tuna has like 5,000 grams of protein. If you didn't know, look it up. I think like a can of tuna is like 40 grams, I think. Salmon has a lot of protein. I like cod. I like flounder. I like kingfish. I like... oh my gosh, like stew fish. I like fish a lot, actually. So I'm not that fazed and I'm not that upset about it because chicken, even though I do love it, has been making me diarrhea in my pants. So it's best for me, my IBS, my health, everything. It's just been better. It's been a hard decision, but it's not as hard as I thought it would be because I do love seafood anyway. So yeah. If there's any other pescatarians, like my mom's a pescatarian. She's been a pescatarian for like my whole life. So it hasn't been hard eating fish. So shout out to all the pescatarians. Mom, I love you. And yeah, that's really all I got. Thank you guys so much for joining me again this week. And let's get into the show. Oh, before we do actually, don't forget to subscribe, follow the show, like the pod, like this episode, rate the show 5 stars, please. And yeah, give me your comments. I hope you guys enjoyed the last few episodes, and thank you all so much for your support. I really love and appreciate all of you guys. And let's get into today's case. Welcome back to the Mer Murder U.S. Serial Killer Series, where we are covering serial killer series from each U.S. state in alphabetical order. This week, we are making our way to the third state on our list, known as the Grand Canyon State. Arizona may be one of the sunniest states in the U.S., but even the sunniest state has its dark days. Today, we will be covering the serial attacks and murders carried out by the Phoenix native Mark Goudeau. Mark Goudeau was born on September 6, 1964 in Phoenix, Arizona, to his parents Willie and Alberta. Mark's childhood was nothing short of chaotic and dysfunctional. His parents worked hard to make ends meet, his mother being a maid and his father a car dealership lot attendant. But it was hard for the couple to support their home of 13. Yes, you heard that right. Mark was the second youngest of 13 children, and his parents were tasked with the responsibility of caring for all of them. One can only imagine the stress that brings upon a family, and according to some of the Goudeau children, their father Willie was verbally abusive and suffered from alcoholism, which ran rampant in the family. On the other hand, one of Goudeau's siblings stated that Willie was simply strict, but the household was peaceful for the most part. But some of us know that even living in the same house and having the same parents, your experiences growing up can be very different from your other siblings. Due to favoritism, resentment, age differences, the list goes on and on. And I can imagine that all 13 children have varying experiences in that household. And the dysfunction in the Goudeau home would only grow worse as Willie and Alberta went on to get divorced, and not too soon after, the family was struck with the devastating death of Alberta. The family matriarch suffered a stroke in 1976 when Mark was just 12 years old. Mark would go on to attend Corona del Sol High School in Tempe, Arizona. Side note, this is actually the same high school that Brooke Schofield, I don't know how you say her name. She attended this high school in Arizona, and I remember her talking about how almost cursed this high school is. So many students that attended there have died over the years, and they've been gruesome deaths, they've committed suicide, they've passed unexpectedly. It's pretty infamous for that type of stuff. And now we're learning that they have a serial killer in their alumnus. So yeah, maybe one day we can do a deep dive on the lore of Corona del Sol and its series of unfortunate events. But anyways, while Mark attended Corona del Sol, he played for the school's football team as a running back and was remembered as being a great athlete. But off the field, he struggled to stay focused on his academic responsibilities. Mark was supposed to graduate in the early 80s, but ended up dropping out because he was just one credit short of his graduation requirement. And failing to be a part of the ceremony, he decided to just join the workforce instead. Mark had difficulty staying out of trouble as he got older and had frequent run-ins with the law due to the increasing severity of his crimes. On November 7, 1982, when he was around 18 years old, Mark and his brother were arrested for raping a student named Donna Sink. But the case was dropped as the young woman was far too afraid to press charges and go against the brothers in court. In 1987, when he was about 23 years old, Mark was charged with trespassing, and the following year he found himself in trouble again for driving under the influence. On August 6, 1989, Mark was about 25 years old when his life of crime took a turn. Mark abducted, raped, and brutally bludgeoned a young woman named Darlene Fernandez. According to Goudeau, he and Darlene met at a local club called Vinny's Nightclub, and the two left together to buy some cocaine. After the purchase, the pair arrived at Mark's apartment, did drugs together, then allegedly had consensual oral sex. According to Mark, after doing so, the pair went to take a bath together when suddenly a man knocked at his apartment door, and upon opening the door, the man forced his way inside to attack Darlene for reasons unknown. Now, this version of the story couldn't have been farther from the truth. On the night of August 6, 1989, officers were dispatched to 2802 East Osborne as witnesses reported watching a man beat a half-naked woman in a parking lot. Upon arriving at the scene, Darlene was found partially conscious, lying in a pool of blood. Darlene's wounds were so severe that officers initially thought that she suffered a gunshot wound to the head. That's how much blood was at the scene. She was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, where she was in serious but non-fatal condition. Darlene suffered from a fractured skull, 7 3 to 4 inch long lacerations that needed stitches, and dozens of bruises all over her body from her neck down. There were no visible signs of external sexual trauma, but 3 days later, Darlene told her full story. If you'd like to skip the details of Darlene's attack, you can find the time code in the description, but everyone else, please listen with care. Darlene was attacked by Mark upon entering his apartment when he hit her over the head with a shotgun and tried to force cocaine in her nose. Mark then forced himself on her and unfortunately raped her. Following the attack, Mark repeatedly beat Darlene over the head with a dumbbell before forcing her into a bathtub and turning on the water, attempting to drown her. Darlene made it clear to officers that there was no one else in the apartment that night and that Mark acted completely on his own. After charges were pressed and the case went to trial, Mark Goudeau was found guilty on 3 counts of aggravated assault for the brutal attack on Darlene Fernandez. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Goudeau was also sentenced an additional 21 years for an armed robbery and kidnapping that he committed a year after Darlene's attack in 1990. Despite the severity of his crimes, Mark presented himself as a much different person than the monster he really was. He was highlighted as a model prisoner and a well-mannered, kind man. Goudeau was eventually paroled in 2004 after only serving 13 years in prison. Upon his release, Mark went home to his wife, Wendy Carr, whom he married during his time in prison, and he moved into their shared home in Phoenix on East Pinchot Avenue. Neighbors of the couple remember Mark as an unassuming, polite, and pretty shy man. This reputation far preceded his rap sheet of violent crimes, and neighbors assumed he was just an ex-con who made changes in his life for the better. And this was easier to believe thanks to the help from his wife Wendy, who often spoke highly of her husband and was one of the biggest reasons why Mark was paroled in the first place. Upon his release, Goudeau, now 39 years old, would begin working as a construction worker for a company called Select Build, and lived as if he was a normal, hard-working husband. But little did everybody around him know that they were existing alongside the man who would go on to be known as the Baseline Killer. The Baseline killings referred to a series of rapes, armed robberies, and murders that took place in Phoenix, Arizona, surrounding Baseline Road. The brutal crime spree began in August of 2005, just 1 year following Mark's parole. The first attack took place on August 6, 2005. 3 young women in their early 20s, 2 of them sisters and 1 of them pregnant, were walking down 48th Street on Baseline Road at around 9 p.m. The group of young women were ambushed by a man and forced behind a church at gunpoint. The man shoved the young women into a group of bushes, forced them to undress, and proceeded to sexually assault 2 of them. During the attack, the pregnant young woman noticed the attacker put his gun down, and she picked it up and pointed it at the man in an attempt to save her sister, friend, and herself. But unfortunately, the young woman was unable to fire the weapon, and she and the man began struggling for control. One of the other young women jumped into the fight, but both were ultimately overpowered, and the attacker aimed his weapon between the pregnant woman's legs and forced her to beg for her baby's life. The man decided against murdering the young mother and her baby, instead turning his focus on getting rid of any evidence that could possibly tie him to the crime. He forced the young women to mix their saliva and mud together and rub it all over their chests to taint any viable evidence. The perpetrator then fled into the night, leaving the young women traumatized and escaping any consequences. Just 8 days following the attack of the young women, on August 14, 2005, another woman was attacked on 2425 East Thomas Road at around 4:10 a.m. The woman was sexually assaulted and robbed before the attacker took off into the night, and law enforcement would publicly refer to the perp of these attacks as the baseline rapist. But unfortunately, just a month following these attacks, the perp's crimes would escalate, and the baseline rapist would become the baseline killer. On September 8, 2005, 19-year-old Georgia Thompson was found dead outside of her apartment at 3730 South Mill Avenue in Tempe, Arizona. Georgia had recently moved from Idaho to Arizona almost 2 months prior to her murder and worked as a waitress at Hooters and also a dancer at a bar called Skins. The night of her murder, Georgia and a coworker/friend of hers went to Acme Roadhouse, a local bar in Tempe, where they spent some time together and had some drinks before heading to work at Skins. After their shift, the women returned to Acme where Georgia had left her car, and the two women said their goodbyes before Georgia got in her car and made her way home. Georgia arrived at her apartment about 10 to 15 minutes later, but unfortunately, she never even made it to her front door. At around 1 a.m., a 911 call was made. Neighbors were called hearing screams from outside of the complex, along with what sounded like a firework. When police arrived at the scene, they found Georgia Thompson lying on the ground with her pants unzipped, her groceries strewn about, and her car keys still in her hand. Georgia suffered from a gunshot wound to the head, and her death would be the first of the baseline murders, but unfortunately, not the last. Officers would find nothing of use at the scene of the crime, and due to Georgia's fresh roots in the city, there were little to no leads on who could have done this to her and why. Georgia left behind her family consisting of her parents and 8 of her siblings, and sadly, her dreams of becoming a model would die along with her. 3 months later, on December 12, 2005, 39-year-old Tina Washington was on her way home from the preschool she worked at as a teacher. At around 6:55 p.m., Tina was abducted from a bus stop at gunpoint near 44th Street. Tina was forced behind a building by a strange man, and sadly, she was shot point blank in the head. A man who lived in a studio just outside the crime scene opened his door and came face to face with the man holding the gun and standing over Tina's body. The witness immediately shut his door and phoned the police. The suspect hastily fled the scene and was once again scot-free, as police were only able to recover 2 .38 caliber shell casings from the scene and no DNA. Tina Washington was murdered only about 8 minutes down the street from where Georgia Thompson was murdered. 2 months later, on February 20th, 2006, the bodies of 38-year-old Romelia Vargas and 24-year-old Myrna Palmer Roman were found in the back of their food truck on 91st Avenue and Lower Buckeye Road. Customers of the women began lining up in front of their truck, the Grill King Express, which usually opened at around 5:30 a.m. It appeared as though the ladies were in business, as the lights were on in the truck and the smell of food cooking on the grill wafted through the air. But as time passed, there were no signs of the women, and patrons grew increasingly concerned. One of their regulars arrived at the food truck at around 7:30 a.m. The man noticed that a strangely large group of people were waiting outside of the truck. It wasn't like the women to leave their customers waiting or provide slow service, so the man decided to investigate himself. Upon peeking over the counter of the truck, the man found both Romelia and Myrna lying on the floor of the truck profusely bleeding. The man immediately dialed 911 and entered the back of the truck to try to give the women CPR and keep them alive, but unfortunately, Romelia and Myrna died of their injuries at the scene. When officers arrived, they found little evidence at the crime scene, and initially they did not group the murders of Romelia and Myrna with the previous 2. Instead, they suspected that these murders were drug-related, even though a pattern slowly began to emerge in the murders. Both Romelia and Myrna had their pants unzipped and slightly pulled down, as if they were sexually assaulted, and this was the same way that Georgia was found. But testing showed in all 3 cases that these women were not subject to any sexual assault. And to interrupt real quick, part of me thinks that this conclusion of the drug-related murder is pretty racist. I don't see any information on how investigators could have come to this conclusion besides the fact that Romelia and Myrna were Hispanic, but we'll get into that later. So Romelia and Myrna's murders went unsolved for a brief period of time. Their usual docking spot where they served food became flooded with flowers and memorials for the women, as they were very much loved and respected by their community. Both women left behind large families, Romelia having 6 children and Myrna having 5 that she shared with her boyfriend. As the families and community mourned the loss of 2 women, the killer was still on the loose and took no time to strike again. Just a little under a month later, on March 15, 2006, the bodies of 20-year-old Liliana Sanchez Cabrera and 23-year-old George Chu were found in the surrounding areas of North 24th Street in Phoenix. Liliana and George were both employees at Yoshi's Restaurant, a local Japanese restaurant located on 24th Street and Indian School Road. After wrapping up their shifts, George offered Liliana a ride home, and the young woman politely accepted the offer. Unfortunately, during their journey home, the 2 young adults were ambushed by a man with a gun. He shot George in the back of the head and threw his body out of the car before driving off with Liliana still in the vehicle. Eventually, the man shot the young woman in the head, dumped her body in a fast food restaurant's parking lot, and fled the scene, but not before unzipping Liliana's pants to pose her the same way the other female victims were found. At around 9 p.m., the body of Liliana was discovered in the parking lot, and George's body was found shortly after, about a mile away. The only evidence left at the scenes would be the shell casings from the bullets of a .38 caliber gun. The murders of George and Liliana would be the 5th and 6th murders in the surrounding area of Baseline Road, and investigators were beginning to suspect that they had a serial killer on their hands. But it was getting difficult to determine if the serial killer was one they had already been aware of or someone completely different. You see, during the same exact time of the Baseline killings, there was already a separate pair of serial killers on the loose. Just 3 months prior to what we know as the Baseline murders, a spree of random shootings were taking place in the same Phoenix metro area. These murders and crimes were referred to as the Phoenix serial shooter crimes, where in cities across Arizona such as Mesa, Chandler, Avondale, and Taliesin, innocent people and even animals were being gunned down at random, some dying on the spot. And numerous locations of the serial shooter crime shared many streets and neighborhoods as the Baseline killings, and this made it difficult for law enforcement officers to conclude whether or not all of these murders were related. And at no point did the pressure ease up either, as the citizens of Phoenix were growing more and more concerned, traveling the city in a constant state of paranoia and demanding not only answers but action from the Phoenix Police Department. All while the serial killers of the metropolitan Phoenix area continued their crime sprees. Just 2 weeks following the murders of Liliana and George, another innocent life would be taken on March 29, 2006. The body of 26-year-old Kristen Nicole Gibbons was found at around 12 a.m. on North 24th Street. A week before her discovery, a businessman noticed streaks of blood throughout the gravel of a parking lot and called police to the scene as he suspected something terrible had taken place. Officers that arrived on scene canvassed the area and found nothing, at least nothing they thought of value in regards of the blood on the scene, and they packed up and wrapped up their investigation. But just a few days later, on April 4th, 2006, that same businessman would call authorities once again to report the discovery of Kristen's badly decomposed body. The man found himself searching that same area because he couldn't ignore the overwhelming foul odor trailing the street, and unfortunately, he would be the one to figure out the source, despite trying to call for help the first time. Kristen was found just a few blocks away from where George and Liliana were murdered and discovered, and officers were becoming more and more sure that the string of murders must all be connected. So Phoenix police decided to increase the police presence on the streets surrounding Baseline Road and other major cities. Undercover and uniformed officers were strewn about the city streets at all hours of the night in hopes of catching the Baseline killer, or at least increasing the safety of the locals. But unfortunately, there were still a consistent string of sexual assaults and armed robberies occurring in the streets of Phoenix, all associated with the perp of the Baseline killer. 6 days after the discovery of Kristen Gibbons' body, 37-year-old Sophia Nunez was found dead in her home on April 10, 2006. And sadly, the discovery was made by her 8-year-old son. The young boy returned home from school that Monday evening, and upon entering the home, he heard water running in the bathroom, so he assumed his mother was taking a bath and went about his day. After noticing that the water had been running for a long time and had actually been leaking from behind the bathroom door, the little boy went to check on his mother. As he entered the bathroom, he was faced with a gruesome scene. Sophia, his mother, was in the bathtub, half naked, with a gunshot wound to her head. The bullet in her body matched the .38 caliber bullets found at the other 7 crime scenes. Sophia's son courageously pulled his mother out of the tub after dialing 911 for help. He tried his best to give her CPR, but unfortunately it was too late for his mother, and Sophia Nunez was pronounced dead at the scene. Sophia not only left behind her family, including her 3 children, but also a major key in the baseline killer investigation. Investigators would eventually learn that her killer was someone that she knew, an ex-boyfriend of hers, in fact, and it would further solidify their suspicions on who they would later believe the baseline killer to be. On May 5th, 2006, Phoenix police released the details of 18 crimes associated with the baseline killer investigation. Among this information was a composite sketch created of the perpetrator using the information given to the investigators by surviving victims of his attacks. The man in the sketch was identified as a light-skinned African-American man who wore a fisherman's hat, had a mustache, and had medium-length locks in his hair. An offer of $100,000 was proposed to the public for any information regarding the crimes or an identification of the man depicted in the sketch. And even though using ballistic testing, the investigators were able to tie all the murders to one single weapon, the baseline killer was still able to claim the life of one last innocent victim. On June 29, 2006, a CCTV camera captured the abduction of 37-year-old mother of 2, Carmen Miranda. Carmen was washing her car at the self-service car wash located on East Thomas Road, just about half a block from the other baseline killer crime scenes. During this visit to the car wash, Carmen was on the phone with her boyfriend when she was approached by a man who she thought was homeless. She told her boyfriend to hold on as the man began speaking to her, but suddenly a scream from Carmen rang out and the call dropped. The boyfriend on the other end of the line immediately called 911 to report that his partner was in some sort of danger. And shortly after this call, Carmen's boyfriend, along with her brothers, came rushing to her last known location. The men couldn't find Carmen for hours, and it wasn't until around 9:30 p.m. when they discovered her car behind a barber shop. In the vehicle lay 37-year-old Carmen Miranda. She sustained a bullet wound to her head, and her pants were unzipped as if she were sexually assaulted. Carmen's family was devastated, and they immediately called 911 to report the discovery of her body. This time, officers had more hope in catching the baseline killer, as his actions this time around were not only in broad daylight, but also captured on camera. Luckily for them, though, in July of 2006, all of the pieces of their investigation would slowly start to fall into place, as they were given the identity of the man in the composite sketch. A woman who requested to remain anonymous identified the man in the sketch as 41-year-old Mark Goudeau, and this led to a domino effect of evidence and circumstances being revealed. Upon hearing this name, Officer Clark Schwarzkopf immediately recognized Mark Goudeau as he was previously involved in his previous criminal cases. Mark was immediately put under police surveillance as the investigators dug through the baseline crime cases to further solidify their suspicions of Goudeau. After recovering the DNA from the first case of the baseline crime spree, the case where the 3 young women were coming home from the park and were attacked and 2 of them were sexually assaulted, the DNA was retested at the Arizona State Laboratory using a more advanced system where the testing focused on the Y or male chromosome. Due to Mark's previous incarceration, his DNA was already in the criminal database and was able to be cross-examined with the DNA currently being tested, and lo and behold, the DNA was a perfect match. Even though the DNA evidence found could only tie Mark to the initial baseline assault, officers were sure they had enough to take Mark in for all the baseline crimes. So Mark Goudeau was arrested on September 6, 2006, and charged with sexual assault while also being tied to the baseline killer spree. And to the surprise of many, especially his family and wife, Wendy Carr, who insisted they had the wrong man and this all must have been a mistake, he was still taken into custody. Wendy was notably outspoken about her stance on Mark's innocence, insisting that their marriage was perfect and Mark was, quote, the nicest man she ever met. She insisted that the DNA found associated with the case was not Mark's and that people were just jealous of their outstanding marriage. Following Mark Goudeau's arrest, officers searched his home for further evidence that could link him to the baseline killings. They found a pair of bloody sneakers that belonged to Mark, sneakers that consisted of 2 separate blood samples that would later be identified as belonging to George Chu, Mark's 5th victim, and Kristen Gibbons, his 7th victim. They also found a ring with the words, "We love Mom," inscribed on it, along with the names of loved ones. This ring would be revealed to belong to 39-year-old Tina Washington, Mark's 2nd victim. And it was later discovered that Mark was the ex-boyfriend of Sophia Nunez, his 8th victim, after her daughter recognized his photo on the broadcast at the time of his arrest. After this discovery, investigators were able to tie the DNA and ballistic evidence from Sophia's case to the other baseline victims, and that was the final missing piece of the baseline killer case. Officers could finally say without a doubt that Mark Goudeau was the baseline killer. While the investigation for tying Mark to the baseline killings was underway, he was already on trial for the sexual assault of the 2 young women in 2005. So in September of 2007, despite maintaining his innocence, he was found guilty and sentenced to 438 years in prison. And the justice system wasn't finished with Goudeau just yet, as he was hit with another almost 80 charges, some of which included 9 counts of first-degree murder, 29 counts of sexual assault and sexual abuse, 10 counts of kidnapping, 12 counts of armed robbery, and 13 counts of aggravated assault. The trial began in April of 2011, and Mark again pleaded not guilty despite the overwhelming evidence against him. And not only was the evidence present in the second trial against Mark Goudeau, but so were the witnesses and family members of the victims to some of his crimes. The man who witnessed Tina Washington's murder sat in the courtroom and testified to seeing Mark Goudeau murder the innocent mother and school teacher. Sophia Nunez's son, the youngest witness in the trial, testified to the gruesome scene he fell victim to when finding his mother deceased in their bathtub. Liliana's mother, Juana Sanchez, testified to the pain she faced and continues to face living a life without her daughter. She turned to Goudeau in the courtroom and told him that if she could pull her heart out of her chest to show him how broken it is, she would. The man who found Romelia and Myrna in the back of their food truck later took the stand, describing his traumatic experience of trying his best to revive the women and save their lives. Following his testimony, Romelia's husband followed the man out of the courtroom, and the two shared an embrace as the husband thanked the man for trying his best to save his wife's life and being there for her in her final moments. In October of 2011, after a 6-month-long trial, Mark Goudeau was found guilty of 67 crimes, including all 9 of the murders. In the state of Arizona, a person convicted of first-degree murder may be eligible for death if the jury unanimously finds at least one of the 10 statutorily defined aggravating factors, and the jury in Mark's trial decided he was in fact eligible for the death penalty. So now the tables were turned on Mark, and like many of his victims, he was put in a position to beg for his life. Well, despite his testimony, Mark was still handed the same fate that he decided for the 9 innocent people he murdered, and he was sentenced to a total of 9 death sentences and an additional 1,324 years in prison. Today, 61-year-old Mark Goudeau sits on death row at Arizona State Prison in Tucson, Arizona, and he's still awaiting his execution as his death warrant has yet to be signed due to the lengthy appeals process. But when the time comes, the 9 victims of the baseline killings and their families, as well as the survivors of the dozens of sexual assaults and robberies, will finally get their last piece of well-deserved justice. And before we close our case out, I want to bring us a few steps back into the case and tie one small loose end. Remember the pair of serial killers that were active in the same area at the same time as Mark Goudeau? Those serial killers were Samuel Dietman and Dale Hausner. I actually considered covering their case for this series when I first started my research for the serial killers around the country, but the pair were disqualified since only one of them, Dale, was born in Arizona, and I couldn't find any information about Samuel's background. And I wanted to stick as closely to the rules as I could, but I will give you a brief synopsis of their case here. So 29-year-old Sam Dietman and 32-year-old Dale Hausner were roommates who went on multiple drive-by shooting sprees around Phoenix, Arizona, while under the influence of meth. They claimed the lives of 8 people and injured 19 others from May 2005 to July 2006, beginning their crimes 3 months before Mark Goudeau and ending after their capture a month after Goudeau's last murder. The pair of serial killers were captured following Sam Dietman's confession of his roles in the murders to his friend Ron Horton during a night of heavy drinking. Following Ron's tip to the police, the 2 men were arrested outside of their apartment in Mesa, Arizona on August 3, 2006. During the trial, Sam Dietman pled guilty to 2 of the murders as well as conspiracy to commit. And on July 29, 2009, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dale Hausner was found guilty of 80 charges and 6 of the 8 murders, eventually being sentenced to death on March 27, 2009. But unfortunately, Dale would take his death penalty into his own hands as he was found unresponsive in his cell on June 20th, 2013, just 4 months after his sentencing. It was discovered that Dale had been hoarding his antidepressant pills, and on June 19, 2013, he ingested all of the pills and overdosed. And I only say unfortunately because taking justice into your own hands isn't exactly fair to the victims, so I think it's unfortunate that he didn't spend as much time as he could in prison and that he kind of took the easy way out, if you get what I'm saying. The confirmed victims of Dale and Sam were 20-year-old David Estrada, 44-year-old Nathaniel Schofner, 44-year-old Jose Ortiz, 28-year-old Marco Carrillo, 20-year-old Claudia Gutierrez Cruz, and 22-year-old Robin Blasnek. The two suspected victims were 39-year-old Tony Mendez and 56-year-old Reginald Remillard. And as we wrap up today's case, I just want us to take a moment to remember the baseline murder victims as well as the victims of the Phoenix serial shooters. I think at a certain point in serial killer cases, we tend to become desensitized and see these real people with real stories as just numbers or tallies on a serial killer's count. And I just want us to remember that these people were just like you and I. They had people who loved them, looked forward to a lifetime with them, and deeply missed them. They did not deserve to have their lives cut short, and definitely not in such a traumatizing and frightening way. And they definitely don't deserve their lives and legacies to just be reduced to someone's tally or number on a kill count. So I want us all to remember these real people who were really loved, and I really hope they all rest in peace. So we're now at the part of our episode where we do our police/detective rating and judge/jury rating. If you're new here, we do A+ through F- or S tier if they're extraordinary, and sometimes they just get cussed clean out. But we will start with the Phoenix Police Department, and I'm giving them a B. I feel like you guys are probably expecting me to give them a harsher rating, but honestly, I really think that the Phoenix Police Department did the best they could do. Sometimes you really just have to put yourself in these people's shoes. And if I were in charge of a police department or an officer on here, again, they have to risk their lives every day they go into work. I have a lot of respect for that. But to have 3 serial killers on the loose at the same exact time in the same exact space, that is unfathomable. Like, that is crazy. I would be horrified. I would be horrified to go to work. I would be horrified for my family. I would be scared and anxious every day. And me personally, some people really have the guts and the balls. Me, as Mercedes, would throw up every single day because I don't know if I'm going to die. I don't know if the people I love are going to die. I don't know where this person is, how many of them there are. That is frightening. So scary. So honestly, I have to use my empathetic bone when I give my ruling for this department. And I really do think they deserve a B, maybe even a B+. Because Mark murdered 9 people in a 10-month span. And then not only that, he assaulted and robbed dozens of people at the same time. And I didn't really touch on the assaults and robberies in this case, but in between his murders, Mark did not take anything close to a break when it came to terrorizing the people, especially the women of Phoenix. And if anything made it that clear on how this man was terrorizing the city, I think it was the almost 1,400 years in prison that he got on top of 9 deaths. Do you know the kind of menace you have to be to get 9 death sentences and then 1,400 years in prison? They were horrified of this man. This man is the devil, genuinely. And then you have 2 other serial killers active. I really, you know what? No, we're going to give them an A. I changed my mind. I think they really did their best because also it was a 10-month span. And if we put all the serial killers together, I think it was just like a year. And it's not just a year. Like, people were dying during this year in the same 4x4 square. So that's horrifying. But to be able to catch 3 serial killers in about a 10 to 11 month span, that's really good police work. I'm not going to lie. I'm giving them an A. I changed my mind. Actually, Phoenix, you're killing it. And speaking of A's, that brings us to our judge and jury rating. I'm giving him an A+ because you bet your bottom fucking dollar that Mark deserved those 9 death sentences for each life he took, and then an additional 1,400. Like, come on. They want that man to know that he deserves to rot. They want him to know that he deserves every agonizing second in prison. And I genuinely hope he's getting that. I hope he's having the worst time of his life. And if it was even possible for him to live an additional 1,400 years, I think it would have been well worth it, because he would get to sit in prison and suffer the same way that his victims were forced to. And that is only fair. When I think about judge and juries, when I think of the sentences and the conclusions that they give to these cases, I think at the end of the day, it should always be fair. And for someone to murder 9 people and then torment dozens and traumatize dozens more, I think it's more than fair for you to get an eternity and then some in prison. And yeah, guys, that is the end of today's episode and our 3rd case in the U.S. serial killer series. My sources for this week have been cbsnews.com, murderpedia.org, wikipedia.org, World's Most Evil Killers on Peacock, Season 7, Episode 17, and www.spokesman.com. And yeah, guys, that is the end of today's episode. Thank you all so much for joining me this week and always supporting me. Don't forget to leave the show a rating. Don't forget to comment. Don't forget to follow on Instagram. And I am still, honestly, my goal is by the end of the month to get my TikTok up, running, and consistent. That's really what I want. So hopefully in the next 2 episodes, I can say follow the TikTok and I can try to not get banned, because you can't say murder, you can't say kill, you can't say nothing. Actually, I just found out that censorship is a whole lot bigger than I thought it was. I thought on YouTube we can still cuss and say certain things. Apparently it's at a certain point in the episode. I was like, what the heck? But yeah, I'm going to try my best to censor the show as much as possible so you guys can enjoy it on all platforms. But thank you all so much for your support. I love you all so much. Please take care of yourselves, take care of one another. And if there's anything I want you to take from being here and spending your time with me, it's that I love you and you are important and you are special. But yeah, that is it from me, guys. Thank you all so much for being here. And I can't wait to see you all next week as we put the myrrh in murder. Bye.